Yes, cheers and welcome
Here.
everyone. Um, Abby, thanks for having us and setting this up. And James, thanks for agreeing to be in conversation with me tonight.
No problem. You're one of my favorite people to talk to about art things, so I'm here.
Um, okay, so today's theme is art as necessary. And so I think we were thinking two things with this as like a concept for a conversation, a happy hour conversation. One, just like reiterating the necessity of art in this moment. I think I've been a part of a lot of conversations and seen a lot of writing about just sort of like reduced resources, attention, money, space for the arts right now. Like, I think there's an idea that art is not quite as necessary in a moment where we're self-isolating while we deal with a pandemic as best as we can. Maybe art is not quite as necessary as some other things and some other concerns. And I thought it would be nice to have a conversation that pushed back a little bit against that, particularly for those of us who work in the arts, for those of us who love the arts, for those of us who are artists or support artists. There's a way that it, it feels necessary to reiterate that art is one of the things that makes us fundamentally human. We as a species have never lived without it. It's as fundamental to us as language. There's science behind this, that artists are part of the great joy of our society and of our lives, that artists also, deserve to have their humanity, their creativity, their economic needs recognized. And so there's that piece that feels really crucial in this moment. And then also the idea of that art can be medicinal. So like the way that something gets prescribed to you, like a kind of like a topical ointment, maybe you sort of like repeatedly administer it as necessary. I feel like me and a lot of folks I'm in community with are consuming a lot of art right now. We're arting as necessary. And so that feels like it might be like a fruitful conversation for us to have as people who, are in this field and love it. And I thought who better to be in conversation with about that than James Claiborne, who is one of Philadelphia's treasured arts programmers. I think a lot of people who know James from his work in many Philadelphia organizations would appreciate that he is somebody who also sees art as necessary, as medicinal, as grounding, as important in all moments. And so of course necessary in this one. And so James, if you have any opening remarks, comments that you want to kick off around your thoughts around this, sort of arting in the time of COVID-19.
Yeah, I'm really I am blessed and grateful to have a life just like wrapped in art. We could do shout outs, endless shout outs for the folks who are on this call, who I spend time with talking about this moment. And so I've been thinking a lot about, art as necessary, art as remedy, and also the role of artists. I want to be close to artists. I'm in conversation with artists in a moment like this, in the way that artists kind of give us permissions that we don't always take to feel what we feel and work through those feelings in a moment like this, but also the reverse, to escape. And so there's this way that I think the artists are doing kind of dual roles for me through their work, but also through their kind of minds and through their lived expressions, that for me is kind of balm and necessary.
Yeah, and that also feels important as, we're not, artists and arts workers, arts producers don't exist in a vacuum. We're dealing with everything that everyone else is dealing with. Some of us are makers, some of us are not makers. We're in family and community with folks who are dealing with COVID, folks who are trying to nurse themselves back to health, people who are passing away from it, people who are frontline workers. All of those folks are I think important to hold in this moment, that I think for some people making and consuming art isn't separate from this conversation. It's part of the DNA of it. Um, And so just, to be a little bit indulgent, I am going to share my screen. I have a few slides just so James and I could ground a conversation around like the multiple ways we're thinking about art right now, and the necessity of art right now. So if you will give me a moment.
Take all the moments.
Okay, and we got it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to start with, I'm thinking about this Carrie Mae Weems image standing outside the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is an image that's really near and dear to me for people who have ever come to where I work at PAFA. You know that this is something I look at every day. It's physically like it's on my desktop. And part of what I feel like I'm meditating on in this moment of self-isolation is the way that, I'm wanting to tap into the kind of self-possession that you always get from Carrie Mae Weems in her work when she's doing solo photography. I also, I'm missing our Philadelphia arts institutions. I miss being in galleries. I miss looking at work in person. That feels frivolous to say. And yet at the same time, I know I work with people who that's a thing that grounds them in the world. I'm friends with a number of artists who will talk about their favorite gallery or their favorite piece of work in a museum in Philadelphia, or in a public art space if it's a mural, a place that they go to regularly to sort of ground and center themselves and get inspired to make work. And so I always think about the fact that, museums, for some people, museums are like their version of a kind of church, a kind of communing with the practice that goes back centuries. And so this is a kind of like hallowed ground to be missing in this space when we can't go into institutions that we want to be in. And then I also, Carrie Mae Weems has done a number of series where she has photographed herself in vast space in isolation. And so I'm always, conscious of the fact that work rarely feels lonely to me. And so in this moment, I'm wanting to lean into this, what does it mean to be socially distant because it's necessary, because this is a pandemic, but also not to feel like that's an act of loneliness, that is that's a generous social practice.
I think I read in preparation for this, I was trying to find an article I read a long time ago where Toni Morrison was quoted. I couldn't find it, but I found another one. And Toni said in that article, I want to feel what I feel, right? Because my feelings are my own. And so this image, when you send it over, just kind of floored me, because being a museum worker, I'm with you. In the gallery, Nina Simone said, music was as close to God as she knows, and in some ways, art is as close to God as I know. And the way that we commune with artists and audience and create those bridges, I think that often for a lot of us, museums and art spaces are really kind of they are hallowed ground. They are kind of holy ground. We used to sing a song in church called "We Are Standing in Holy Ground," and I hum it to myself sometimes in moments when I'm in a gallery, because that feeling is tangible. And so for me, this kind of embodies being home and missing that building at 7th and Arch, and missing the art and missing the programs we were supposed to have. And there's something that like Carrie is embodying, kind of where I stand now, looking longingly. And I think there's something interesting, though we don't see Carrie's face. In this moment, the gaze feels really long because I think if you're an arts worker now, you're living in this moment, you're responding, you're real time, you're creating digital programs, but you're looking, 2021, pondering what are our spaces going to feel like on the other side of this. And so I love that artists create this moment for us, but they give us a moment to pause and to sit in our feelings, because I think to feel and to wrestle with our feelings and try to turn that into action or resolution, or just to rest in that moment, I think is very human.
Yeah, and then I'm also, I did not mean for this to become like a Carrie Mae Weems meditation, but I'm thinking with her often. I've been thinking about this kitchen table series often lately, as my home office is actually my kitchen table, and it's that same sort of light grain wood, and so I'm thinking about how many of us are trying to be creative and try to be productive and try to make work in solitude, and again, we're having a million conversations about this behind the scenes, but I'm also always really sort of moved by how creatives in general, how artists always manage to make work wherever they are. And this is an iconic series that all takes place in, she did all this self-portrait photography in her kitchen table, like at her kitchen table in her house. And so while I've been thinking, worrying about how are we going to be creative in solitude, how are we going to take this communal practice of art making, which for a lot of us is really communal, and shrink it down to this kind of social distanced, solitary work. I'm again wanting to harness this energy of just because you are now working in a confined space does not mean that it has to confine your imagination or your creativity or your production. And again, she also, she looks so self-possessed in this image, like she is at peace in solitude, playing solitaire, in the spotlight that she has created for herself, which is the kind of energy I think a lot of us are trying to tap into right now. And this one is actually James's. So this is, we often joke that we're on a kind of mind meld. And so while I'm, sitting in solitude, thinking about tapping into a kind of power that I think I get, and looking at the brilliance of Carrie Mae Weems, James is similarly on a wavelength, thinking about the relationship between Carrie Mae Weems and Deborah Willis.
And this is, of course, Carrie Mae Weems, who we just saw in a salon. And of course, Deb is taking this photo. And so this was at the museum, I want to say 2018. We had an exhibition called Went Looking for Beauty, which had a series of images from Dr. Willis. And I just love the way that Deborah Willis causes us to pause. And I remember being in the gallery and watching audiences move around, and we had a organization of her images, a selection of her images that were dealing with beauty shops. And I remember it wasn't this particular image, but there was another image where she took just a very kind of almost architectural image of the device that heats the hot combs. And so this is, a photo of this device and you can actually sort of see a version of it just above Carrie Mae Weems's head, where these hot combs are kind of centered. And so she took a photo where, that device appliance was like right framed. And I remember an audience member walking up to it and saying, I can smell the hair burning. And so I think Deborah Willis is always, and a lot of artists are always wrestling with, or causing us to stop and wrestling with memory. And so that's why this image, when we talked about Carrie Mae Weems and we were trying to think of how to move, I thought of this image and I thought of that story and that woman, and I'll never forget that. And when she said that, I could smell hair burning, right? And there's a way that I think artists are in this moment where we're stuck in our homes, when we're self-isolating, where we can't go to our favorite places to eat, where we can't be in communion with each other in the way that we're used to, the powerful role memory can be. And we often talk about smell, kind of being able to engage that, but it's interesting that you don't have to actually smell a thing, that art can invoke the senses and there invoke memory, and that kind of rest over your body. And so in moments like this, I think I'm always looking for work. I found myself going through images of AMP and remembering different performances, you know, Cotton in Motion, you know, where the dancers kind of embodied enslaved individuals moving through John Dowell's exhibition. And I want to remember the way I feel in this moment where I can't operate in that same way. And there's a way that, I don't know, you don't even have to be physically with the art to kind of have this physical kind of connection to it that can be evoked in just a moment. Yeah, and then so here, you know, we're talking about AMP and we're talking about, you know, museums and all of you are on the line. And so I imagine that you've had a moment or you have a photo. We all have a photo like this. I have photos like this with multiple people on the line, including Dr. Webb. And I don't know, as I was looking through them, I'm watching and I'm looking at just the physical proximity of bodies. I'm teaching audience development in the arts for Westfall College for art and entertainment undergraduate students. And so it's supposed to be a Thursday night class that quickly became an online class. And so this moment when you have to stop and think about like, how do you teach audience development in a moment like this that has the potential to shift? And so I'm looking at the women kind of touching each other. I'm looking at that kind of proximity that we're all kind of hesitant about and lamenting a little bit or just worrying about the future of these moments and our ability to be together.
Yeah, I think so much of what's amazing about museums and galleries is that you experience art differently in person than you do in solitude. I think that you definitely you have a different mediated experience standing next to somebody when you know, that moment where you're in the gallery and you and a stranger are like standing in rapture in front of a piece of work, or you know, somebody says something and, you know, 6 people in the room all sigh together at once. That there is a kind of hallowed practice of you know, what are we doing when we experience this work together? You almost feel like this is the way that we're supposed to experience this kind of work. We're supposed to stand together in the galleries and have like an experience with it that is maybe not the same. It's supposed to spark conversation. This is the way we're supposed to be able to talk about it, to commune with it. If you know, if art spaces are your church, if artwork is, if this is sacred and hallowed practice and hallowed ground for you, then this is a thing that it makes sense to miss. It's okay to lament and mourn these things. You know, the human in me also wants to acknowledge, I know a lot of people who are missing their hair shops right now. I feel like there are a lot of internet memes about this.
One of them.
Yes, folks are missing barbers and hairdressers and are very upset that these folks are not considered crucial, life-saving businesses that have to remain open at this time. I
mean, you know, we didn't even stop to think about kind of the social role that these spaces play, you know, for as a queer Black man, I don't necessarily share this affinity for barbershops, but Black barbershops talk about hallowed ground, you know, or hallowed ground for Black men and Black boys, you know, where the social engagement happens, the beauty shop. Dr. Willis will talk about the kind of whisper down the lane moments that she encountered, you know, growing up with her mother in the beauty shop. And so I think, you know, that there is something also socially being lost in this kind of passing of information and practice and tradition that happens within those spaces.
So this is a great image of just, you know, if we're thinking about lines and gathering in groups of people, what does that look like going forward? You know, James, when you talk about teaching audience development, so many of us who are doing work in spaces where we are educators or we're mentors or we're, you know, supervising interns or fellows, so much of what we do and impart and teach relies on us being able to go out into the world and see what it looks like in real time.
Mhm.
You know, I always feel like art is the kind of, it's like a lab, it's not a lab science, but it's a lab science.
Yeah,
But like, how do you teach this to people in a moment where you can't gather like this?
yeah. And also inviting folks to feel safe and comfortable. And a lot of times when we're talking about that, we're talking about kind of a psychological, emotional, intellectual safety that we hope our institutions are providing, especially an institution like AMP that sometimes has to wrestle with the difficult history of the treatment of people of color, kind of globally, or certainly this history within the US. And so we talk about being a safe place to unpack some of that in conversation with artists and scholars. But I think that, I'm wondering about this next level of kind of that idea of safe space then is going to become kind of a quieter physical safe space that we're thinking about how to build. For folks, what happens when we can invite folks back into our buildings, and like how do we continue to create safe environments? And we've all seen the images from across the world where people are lined up 6 feet apart, and many of us probably have been maybe in these queues ourselves, standing 6 feet from folks. And so I'm thinking of the iconic ramps of the African American Museum, which we're looking at here. And I'm remembering this moment of having to dart around folks to get downstairs or get upstairs to start remarks or to find an artist. And I'm wondering, when we'll feel that closeness, that tightness, because in some regards that is the sign of a, there's like the pristine kind of sanctity of being alone in a gallery, but there's something about stepping into a scene that makes you feel connected, that institutions and artists build. And I think people are also looking for that kind of moment, and I hope that we have a future. I believe we have a future with this. The believer in me believes that this is still, and this is within the immediate realm of possibility.
Yeah, I think this impulse to gather, the like beauty of a moment where you're at, an opening reception for an exhibition or for a performance. There's always sort of like a moment where that if you love the arts, that it's, some people might see that as kind of like a nerdy niche thing to care about.
Mhm.
And so being in a busy gallery, being in a full museum, I always have this moment of, oh, this is so many people who care about the same things that I care about.
Yeah.
And there's something that's really nourishing about getting to gather around that. And I'm also thinking about, the hits that our communities are taking in a lot of ways. There's I've been watching these short films over and over and over again. They're music videos, but not quite music videos. And I think that there's the piece of me that is, obsessively really reading these sort of first person accounts of folks who have been ill, who are caring for folks who are ill, who are talking about the unique sort of tragedy of separation in this moment. I'm feeling how often we want to be able to gather to mourn. We want to be able to have funerals. We want to be able to have memorials and commemorate folks who have passed. Not being able to is another kind of trauma on top of trauma that a lot of folks are dealing with. And so there's and both of these shorts, Until the Quiet Comes, which is really brilliantly directed by Khalil Joseph, that I first saw at ICA at Penn, and in this other short directed by Hiro Murai. There are these videos that I have been watching over and over and over for the past couple of weeks, thinking about what it means to want to come together in mourning, that a community actually needs that to have closure around the passing on of somebody, and to not be able to. And this is the kind of like art as medicine moment for me, personally. For people who have not seen these, which anyone can access them. I think they're all on the internet. I keep being moved by the fact that they both feature deceased individuals who physically rise up and then sort of have there's like these amazing there's just this amazing movement where they dance, and it's a kind of celebration of like, I almost interpret it as a kind of like a soul coming out of the body and really getting to like be freed of the body and have a kind of joy. And I'm wanting to hold that in this moment where we can't mark the passing on of people that we've lost in the ways that we typically do. And I think that's a thing that really great artists can give us sometimes, that we don't realize we need. The first time I saw these, I did not think that I would need them in this way, that now it's like a security blanket almost, or like it's like aloe vera gel.
Yeah. I think they spoke to me in this way. That's I love the way the bodies are moving, and I think in both films, the people around them seem to be disconnected or unaware of what's happening. And to me, both of those works kind of spoke to the resilience of spirit, and the belief of like, spirit can perhaps be something tangible to leverage in moments like this, to navigate, to move. It almost kind of, in this moment, it almost kind of, these bodies, these people kind of become their best selves and become separate from kind of earthly groundings. And certainly we all have to get our groceries delivered and figure out how to get food and figure out how to stay well and get masks and all these things. But it's nice to step away from that and to believe in somehow in something higher, even if you don't have the ability to articulate it and define it. There's something about kind of, even if we just talk about the resilience of human spirit, there's somehow like the human spirit can get up in a moment and kind of dance higher than the immediate physicality of kind of an earthly, worldly kind of plane that was powerful to me.
Yeah, and there's there's a way that these pieces are also feel like greater than the sum of their parts. It's not just the direction, it's not just the lighting, it's not just the setting, it's not just the dance, it's not just the music. In the Hiro Murai piece, Never Catch Me, like it's like the movement is like incredibly syncopated, like hip hop, jazz, funk sequence. And in Until the Quiet Comes, like all the movement happens to like the chimes, like I think it's Crazy Legs who's moving to a lot of the chimes, and that vocalist who's singing in that that high pitched melody that it's like it's ethereal. And I feel like that, yeah, I mean, it is a kind of amazing that is difficult to articulate with language. I mean, this is the thing that art does for me, that really feels like a balm right now.
Yeah.
And so, I'm, not to have a completely heavy conversation. I feel like we're consuming a lot of art. So there are a million things that are like getting us through this moment. And so I would say like one of them is I'm amazed at all of the DJs who are spinning nightly on Instagram and YouTube for free for the public. And so I like literally 100,000 other people, including, Michelle Obama, are really enjoying Club Quarantine, which is happening on Instagram after night. DJ D Nice, who is the superhero that we did not know that we needed in this moment. I think it's also like nice to have, to have a moment to appreciate that DJing is a kind of art, that the ability to speak to people, to move people, to sort of soothe people at the end of every day is like an amazing thing to be able to do from the solitude of your apartment, just to put out through these digital channels, like to know that in this moment that is so troubling for so many people for so many reasons, that this is a kind of joy that we can have in community, even as we're social distancing. There's like a real brilliance to that. And so I'm also, I'm following a lot of them. Questlove has been spinning, if not every night, almost every night. And it's also like fun to have a kind of, Philadelphia's own, who is doing these kind of sets where there's a lot of really lovely narration about the history of a track that's being played, whether that's about the musicians who are on it, or the artist that it inspired, or how a song is in conversation with other traditions. It's like, it's a really beautiful thing to get to consume, even if I, am just sitting and listening and not, dancing in my kitchen. Tiger King mania is absolutely, I mean, Abby and I have talked about having a whole Tiger King conversation. I feel like a lot of serious people have been texting me about, have you seen this Tiger King documentary? Because it is madness.
It's unbelievable.
I mean, it's a 7-hour romp. For a lot of people don't know this about me, I'm obsessed with grifters and scammers. I'm like fascinated by the way a scammer is able to convince seemingly sane people to do and believe insane things. There's like a kind of, like, the psychology of that is endlessly fascinating to me. And also the fashion, I mean, so many things. I did not know that there were exotic animal collectors. I'm used to thinking about other kinds of collectors. There's this, I could mine this endlessly. I appreciate, the kinds of creativity and resilience in this moment that we're seeing in media. So people might not know, this week, Saturday Night Live still aired a show that was the social distancing edition of Saturday Night Live. And I was really kind of amazed again at the ways that, I'm thinking really broadly about artists, not just visual artists, but performers, DJs, dancers, musicians, comedians, trying to produce something like an episode of a sketch comedy show in social isolation is a thing that I would not wish on anybody. And so seeing them even attempt this, hearing that they were going to attempt this, was amazing. There's also an incredible sketch around those of us who are trying to work on Zoom, that I was like, oh, this is a Zoom sketch that they had to film on Zoom because we're all social isolate. I mean, it was like Zoomception. And so I appreciate so much that, like, oh, we really are in this together, that like the New Yorkers who are locked down, the performers are still figuring out a way to perform and commune with their audiences in this moment. I'm also doing a lot of reading. I started, which may have been a mistake, Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler recently, which, for folks who know Octavia Butler's work, she writes science fiction in, I cannot even begin to describe the ways, but it's set in this kind of apocalyptic moment that feels really resonant right now. And there's something about reading that feels, it feels appropriate at the same time that it is anxiety producing. And so there's also, for balance, I really appreciate the searing wit of Michael Arsenault. And so I started reading I Don't Want to Die Poor, which is, he's a young essayist who really writes brilliantly about life and culture and what it is to be like a millennial living in a city, just trying to make it work, trying to deal with student loans, I love
that book, I Can't Date Jesus. I'm like, there's content that's coming out now, not Tiger King, but like some of this Octavia Butler, some of this Issa Rae, the Lena Waithe of the world are producing content for young Black millennial Generation X. Is written with a specificity that it seems like they're stepping into your lives. And so this is what I appreciate about this moment. And also the Octavia Butler, like one of the first things I did when I came home for self-isolation was to watch Contagion, right? and because it's like, you talk about leaning into a moment, But I feel like this is the role of like Octavia Butler, who's writing about these kind of dystopian futures, but through a Black lens. And so I think there is like, you know, this is also a time where artists kind of hone in on, it seems like they're talking directly to you in a moment or through a book or through a writing. And I think, you know, when you realize that there are, like when I saw 10 people talking about, you know, Octavia Butler and Parable of a Sower, I knew that there was like something there. So I'm trying to work on a program for AMP that kind of centers on that. And so this is also a moment where artists are bringing us together, or when art makes you realize that like how you are not alone and very connected.
Yeah, and James and I both read Emergent Strategy last year. And so this is also, you know, the you are not alone, we are all in this together kind of text that is thinking about what it means to just move through the world differently, especially if we're thinking about, if, you know, being inspired by nature. And so when when James and I were talking about this, I was thinking like, oh, like what are we watching? What are we listening to? I feel like I'm looking at a lot of, you know, there are a million artists that I follow on social media. I'm paying a lot of attention to right now. Like, what are we reading? I feel like Emergent Strategy is really appropriate for this moment where we're thinking about new ways of being and communing in the world as it changes in real time.
I love the way art and a book like this gives you permission to question, you know, because, you know, this book is moving and kind of pushing against a certain type of capitalism that we all in some ways have to participate in for our livelihood. And I remember how powerful it was reading a segment of this book where Adrienne is questioning the fact that like oftentimes your livelihood, your ability to have food and to have shelter is dependent upon your participation and she has some way of describing your participation in capitalism or to make money for another. And like, if you are for some reason unable to participate in that, then like your basic human kind of necessities become much more tenuous, right? And fraught. And so there's a way that I think I'm having this conversation with artists over and over again, where they're just like giving me permission to feel the way I feel in a moment. And even if I have to work through that feeling towards productivity, there's something powerful about knowing that this innate feeling, whether it be fear, whether it be worry, you know, anxiety, is kind of human and it's okay and it's yours. And that's what I think Emergent Strategy does a lot for me. It gives me permission to question.
Yeah, and even though it's not a fictional text, I think that part of what's nice about fiction, I think, is stepping into another world. And what I love about sort of reading nonfiction, whether that's creative nonfiction, whether that's memoir or essay or philosophy, is there is a way that it felt appropriate to sort of invoke these writers in this moment, in a conversation about artists and what necessity looks like right now. Is that I feel like these are all kind of writers, performers, thinkers, makers are all sort of giving us permission to sort of tap into ways of being and thinking that we wouldn't under normal circumstances. And they also give us tools for reimagining the world. I think a lot of us are trying to figure out what the world is going to look like after this, or coming to terms with there may not be an after. This may not be the kind of thing that we experience in a finite way. And so it might always just be the long duration of constantly coping and regrouping. And so that feels fruitful in this moment. That feels as necessary as, bread, milk, and eggs.
Yeah. And she's also kind of acknowledging the small moments, right? She talks a lot about like kind of the way cells operate and within a body to kind of create human existence, the way, that then translate into patterns within nature. And so there's a way that like a book like this kind of empowers the little things that we do that sometimes don't seem to immediately add up to big change. It doesn't make that seem for naught. It gives kind of a power and a voice and kind of plugs that into a system that can create change. And there's something in this moment that's beautiful to think about, the fact that you're staying at home is saving the lives of other folks, and and the little things that we can do that can create kind of brighter futures or better futures.
Yeah. I'm gonna stop the share. I'm also hoping to hear from some other folks about how they're feeling, how they're making work right now, what they're consuming right now, what's the how are you participating in conversation about the arts right now? I think I know a lot of makers and a lot of producers who feel like it's a difficult thing to ask people to support in this moment, but also if you need it, then you need it. And so like, how do we all like name that kind of necessity, that artists are allowed to have needs too, that makers are allowed to have needs, arts organizations and arts producers, we are allowed in this moment to experience this resource loss as loss, and to also advocate for the necessity of that as well. Just what does that look like in the time of COVID-19?
Yeah, and for people just who weren't here at the beginning, if you want to raise your hand, we'll call on you virtually. If you go down to the participant button, you should see it on the side of your screen, or you can also use the chat function. We already got in the chat a while back, someone asked if art is a connector, how that will change. I think we can throw that out to everyone, but also just something to think about, since I don't think any of us know necessarily how we'll change in the face of this or anticipated it, but I'd love to hear from all of you.
I unmuted, but I can't figure out how to raise my hand.
Okay, well, why don't you go for it?
Let's go for it. Well, I miss being at the museum, especially because I'm a new docent. And in order to stay sane in this time of having to stay in, I've been doing art. So every day I draw something. Either I go and look out of the door or out of the window and draw something or sketch something and put my great-granddaughter in it. She keeps me sane, I guess, or crazy or something like that. I don't know. But how are things, apparently to me, I feel they're going to be decidedly different. I'm not sure that the crowds are going to exist anymore. You know, the people to get that togetherness that used to be before. That's all.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara, for sharing that.
Thank you, Barbara.
Anything else? And if you have trouble with the hand function, let me know, or you just wave and we'll find you.
You know, I can't figure out the hand function.
I understand. And I'm going to try to mute you. Sorry.
Okay, I'll mute. I know how to mute me, but the hand.
All right. Hold on, Barbara. I'm going to mute you, and then we're going to call Brooke. Did I see your hand? Yeah.
Brooke.
I was trying to, thanks, Abby. I was trying to figure out where that hand was in the Zoom dictionary. James and Brittany, thank you so much for taking us into your worlds and sharing so much of your current thinking. James, I think you talked about thinking a lot right now about art as remedy.
Mm-hmm.
And Brittany, I heard you also say art as medicine, thinking about art as medicine. And I think you both were framing at two different points in the conversation, this need, as I heard it said by you, as being kind of necessary, since we're talking about the necessity of art. And I wonder about art as remedy and medicine, particularly within the museum setting. So we can talk about it for the practicing artists and what it means to practicing artists. I'm then also interested in what it means for our institutions. And if we have a responsibility as institutions in Philadelphia to provide that remedy in medicine, I of course would like to think that that is forefront in our mission and in our goals. But how do we do that? How do we provide the medicine and the remedy with social distancing being a new factor, with the economy plundering, with so many new challenges that we're going to face? I know we are a creative and talented and resourceful group of professionals in museums around the city, but I just wonder if we have started to talk about how we can be medicinal and providing remedy to our communities.
Yeah, so two things that I've been thinking about as I'm doing a lot of reading is, you know, one that comes out of this, one of the New York Times articles about the arts that was asking, how are museums scrambling to archive this moment? And it was a phrase that like had not actually come to, like I had not thought about that, even though one of the things that I love about museums is the collections and archiving, right? Like the idea that I can be moved by work and be moved by research around the work that happened 100 years, 200 years before anybody was even thinking about me existing at all. And so I had not thought about what our institutions are doing in this moment that might lead to like a different kind of possible future. So that feels like a big provocative question that I'm like, I want to think with a lot of very smart people about what that might look like or what that might mean, what's important about this moment to carry forward. And then the other thing, I think, in a different arts outlet, someone was lamenting in a story that there are, you know, a lot of living artists that they imagine will not have the kind of careers that they would have had they not been stalled by this moment. And that's also, that felt like a kind of really important mourning to be able to name, like the idea of feeling the loss of a future that now might not exist. And it was in a conversation around, you know, who are the people that can afford to continue to make work, whose shows are being canceled, whose income is disappearing, who makes their money as a teaching artist and now does not have an audience in the moment of distancing, who moves work, who is not able to afford a studio anymore. I mean, there's all of the practical things that all artists always have to worry about just to continue to make work and to make a life. But it felt almost silly to me that I had not thought to think about it in those terms until someone was lamenting, like, I just think about all the artists who won't have careers now because of what's happening right now, that it's another kind of loss of a life. It's another kind of loss of a future. And so those are the two things that I keep thinking about. What should museums be doing in this moment when we know that those are two important things if we're thinking about just different kinds of futures? Knowing what we know about the past, how can we think about the futures that will need a kind of archive that we need to be creating now? What is that archive that we need to make now? And what are those careers that we need to be rescuing now?
You know, that article, Brittany, in the New York Times, if I remember it correctly, pointed to some other global moments where we were all catapulted into mourning and loss. And the one that I remember from the article, and of course, being a New Yorker, remember from experience, 9/11. And the New York Historical Society immediately jumped into action on, I think, September 12th. 2001, and started acquiring the ephemera and the objects and the experiences of New York and New Yorkers, and have utilized that archive, as you call it so rightly, again and again and again in the last almost 20 years to make sure that we remember, to make sure that we honor that loss and mourning together. So knowing that that's happening in some museums, I'm not sure where in Philadelphia the collecting is taking place, but in New York. I believe the New York Historical Society has again started to gather the ephemera and the object history of a pandemic. And it will be interesting to see how that gets put to use in a museum setting in a museological manner.
Thanks. Well, I noticed we have a hand from Ivan. Ivan, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you still have a question. There you go. Ivan, are you with us? Suspenseful. All right. Ivan will wait, but also if anyone else, we only have a couple minutes. If you have technical difficulties, let us know. These are such heavy questions. I'm so grateful to have this community here because I don't think, there's no kind of clear pathway for all of us. And so wrestling with them as an artist and as someone who works in an institution, these are things I'm thinking about a lot as well.
I guess somewhere I'm, Brooke, that's the question from the audience that stumps the panelists. I was, it's like, oh, what is the answer to that? And I don't know that I have an answer as much as I have reference points that are pinging for me now. I'm thinking about at AMP, we had a exhibition up called, Brittany will help me remember the name of the exhibition from the art space that was dealing with kind of repetitive systems in mass incarceration and justice system.
Oh, arresting patterns.
Arresting patterns, of course, which was kind of talking about how the justice system kind of disproportionately affects communities of color, and in particular Black men. And so we had that exhibition up. We planned a town hall for a particular Sunday. And, we were already kind of preparing for an intense conversation. And then that week was the week that 3 Black men were killed by law officers, by police. And so then this conversation, I talk about this a lot, this conversation that was already timely became an emergency. And there was something about the timing that the exhibition was up, that we already had the social service folks from the various kind of recidivism and folks who are going to prisons and working with formerly incarcerated populations were already kind of going to be on the stage. We already had an artist who was doing kind of residency work around this. And so there's I picked that with some news reports that I saw about these towns that, because people are self-isolating and staying in, that animals are kind of infiltrating their town. And Emergent Strategies talks a lot about nature, about the systems of nature, and nature always finds a way, and that there's something like, that the geese don't get together and plan these meetings to fly south, but they have these, migration patterns. And we can talk about the way that we as humans kind of interact and mess up those migration patterns. I'm not blind to that. But there's something, in my most hopeful self, I feel that by opening our doors, by doing things that PAFA and AMP have done for decades, and which is being in communion with artists, opening our doors, training artists, showing artists, inviting folks in, that there's something in that will show the way. So there's this way that's like, I don't have the answer, but I trust the moment that, I can get back into space, back into the building, the moment we can open the doors and understand kind of, and with all the data, what life really is, that the moment we can get artists and art and audiences back to being in space with each other, that's when answers to me become kind of revealed. And so, in my most aspirational self, I'm like, I don't know, but I trust that there's an answer kind of in the mission work, that mission work drives us to find those solutions and to find those answers. And sometimes, I think a lot about like the role of museums in moments like this. And there's a way that I think we want to be kind of superheroes and provide kind of be the ones providing answers, but sometimes, you know, we're the ones providing space for communion for folks who would never get together, or folks who would never kind of see different perspectives, and we're that point of kind of information sharing, this kind of translation of data, this translation of information and experiences. I think that's the place I'm eager to get back into, and not being there makes, you know, this unknowing is difficult, but I trust that there's knowing on the other side of something.
Yeah, and I want to really quickly just jump in, because we heard from Ivan in the chat function. So I want to make sure, and I think this is kind of a great question to sort of end on, thinking about your Octavia Butler example, and if there's other artists in the recent past or historic artistic moments that speak to this moment, maybe by predicting it, or I know myself, I've read a little Margaret Atwood that felt very hauntingly like this moment, in the way that so many science fiction writers can do. But I think that's a great one to think about. Maybe not by predicting this moment, but if there are other artists that you're finding solace in this time.
No, since you brought up literature, I feel like I just said to somebody, I owe every English teacher I had in junior high and college like an email where I apologized for every time I read something and said, I'm never going to need this. Because now I'm like, oh, that's why we had to read George Orwell. Or like, oh, that's why we had to read Kafka. Like all of these texts that, you know, you read as a young person, you know, you're 14, 15, 16, like why are they, you know, forcing us to read this? You know, it will never be necessary. And now as an adult, I'm like, oh yeah, all of that, you know, teenagers are wrong about a lot. And so I want to be like, yeah, I was really wrong about a lot of those reading assignments. It's all, you know, I'm with you on the Margaret Atwood. Like it's awesome. Like it's all now. I feel like a lot of that apocalyptic literature was doing that. I think that there have been lots of kinds of futurists who have predicted end of a kind of world and a need to imagine what a new one will look like. I feel like I've been, you know, I've listened to a weird amount of Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye lately. Like that also feels like a similar kind of, who are artists who are making work in times that felt impossible, that were trying to both articulate the impossibility of the historical moment, and at the same time insist that we would all move through it and figure out a new thing.
That the idea of artists making things in a time of the impossible. I think that's a really wonderful note to sort of end our time together. I wanted to thank James and Brittany for being here and leading this conversation and sharing all the things that are getting them through, and showing once again what we all know is that art is so necessary, especially in moments like these. And thank you all so much for coming and being here with us for this community. I know I like the hand raise for all of our silent people. Yeah, and please join us for another one of these again. It's so good to see all of you, and take care. Stay safe. Have a good night, everybody. Cheers. Yeah, hold on. James has the best cup if you haven't seen it already.
Goblet.
Thank you for a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself as you guys are on your way out and say goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, DDA. Bye, Anna. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany.
Bye.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Bye.
Wonderful, Brittany. Wonderful, Jam.
Hey,
Do it again.
Thanks.